to welcome you to the Learning and Work Institute's centenary celebration. It was in 1921 the British Adult Education Institute was created. That was, of course, 2 years after the City Lit, who have bragging rights. And then through many changes of name, mergers, takeovers, by 2016, the Learning and Work Institute resulted. So we've had now 100 years of endeavour. I've been associated with the Institute for a long time. I've been associated with the City Lit for almost the same length of time, both our host and, of course, a partner, perhaps our oldest partner, over 100 years. And I've also been associated with this space because the John Lands charity, of which I was the chairman once, funded its creation, and it's named after the charity. So my three favourite charities all combined together in support of what has been my passion for a long time, which is the promotion of the cause of adult learning. Some 20 years ago, I asked Alan Tuckett whether I might be able to play a part at the Institute. It was not just its long and illustrious history that attracted me. It was because this organisation has always tried to make a difference. Now, a lot has changed in the last 100 years, but not the fundamentals. The fundamental importance of lifelong learning. It's an economic imperative. It's a social imperative. It is essential for our health and well-being. It's a golden pathway to work, and it's essential for building our future as a fair and prosperous society. And yet there is still so much left undone. So today is as much about the future as a celebration of the past. Vision and words are important, but they're not enough. Long before Greta Thunberg talked sarcastically about political promises as blah, 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 John Bunyan cried out in frustration. He said, "Were you doers or were you just talkers?" So my message is, let's rededicate ourselves to doing and making a difference. We need a tectonic shift in political thinking in this, the Institute's second century. Today's event continues now with our Chief Executive.
Well, thank you, Nick. It's always tough following Nick. I can't promise a tour of Greta Thunberg to John Bunyan there, and Nick seems to have been responsible for most of all the organisations that are here today, so I can't quite follow that, but I'll do my best. So, Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure to have so many people here today. I am doubly nervous because this is the largest group of people I've spoken to in person since the pandemic. But also, we are, I hope, live streaming this, so I'm still at risk of accidentally leaving myself on mute at the same time. So bear with me. I hope we're live streaming it, otherwise that joke makes no sense. So as Nick said, this year we mark our centenary, and I think 100 years ago, interest in adult education was growing. You can see that in the foundation of the Workers' Educational Association, City Lit, and so many other organisations. But it wasn't happening in isolation. It was part of shifts in our society more broadly, in many ways accelerated by the effects of the First World War. Young people were staying in education longer, society was opening up, social protections were being extended, and the right to vote was being widened. And adult education was really seen as a key part of that. And the 1919 Ministry of Reconstruction Adult Education Committee put it really well, I think, saying that adult education is a permanent national necessity, an inseparable aspect of citizenship, and therefore should be both universal and lifelong. So universal and lifelong. And it was in that context, as Nick mentioned, that the British Institute of Adult Education was founded back in 1921. There's been so many achievements to be proud of over the decades since, including work with the BBC, our 1935, I say our, it wasn't me, I'm not that old. I feel it, I do feel 100 sometimes. The 1935 Art for the People initiative, which helped to lead to the creation of the Arts Council. Our work with the Army, which started in 1941 and continues to this day, and of course the establishment of Adult Learners Week and the Adult Participation in Learning Survey in the 1990s. So there's lots to be proud of. But for me, a centenary isn't just about celebrating the past. It's about looking to the future, not just about the last 100 years, but about the next 100 years too. And it would be very easy to see just the dark clouds on the horizon. There's 1 million fewer adults in learning than there was a decade ago. Inequalities in access to learning are stark. Those that could benefit most from learning are perhaps least likely to take part. And we've got big challenges ahead, whether that's an ageing population, the need to tackle climate change and Greta Thunberg et al. Playing their role in that. So we've got big challenges ahead. But I'm an optimist, and I think, to be honest, to work in this sector, you kind of have to be sometimes. And we know that all of us here today know that learning can help us to master those challenges ahead. And we know that funding is rising again. Participation is up. Our survey showed that on Monday. And new entitlements to learning are being introduced. So there are bright sparks amongst those dark clouds of the past. And what about us as an organisation? I think existing for 100 years feels like an achievement. But beyond that, we're focused on what we can do as well. So we've got our New Futures programme looking at how to help people to retrain and switch careers. Our survey continues to be the largest source of information on participation in learning. Our citizens' curriculum showed new ways of learning and the wider benefits that they have. Our Skills for Life Alliance is raising the profile of adult basic skills once again. And of course, our Festival of Learning in England and Adult Learners Week and Inspire Awards in Wales continue to celebrate adult learning. And I want to thank once again all of the learners who shared their stories earlier today, because they put it far better than I ever could. So in other words, rather than just looking back and wishing for a better yesterday, we're trying to look ahead and work for that better tomorrow, to be the doers that Nick talked about. And I think linking all of that together is the theme of today's event. Our ambition is for this to be the lifelong learning century, where we make learning as an adult the norm, for any reason or for none. We've heard from our learners earlier the doors that adult learning can open, and actually our survey this week showed people's innate interest in learning. We've seen a real growth in self-directed and online learning during the pandemic. How do we garner that? How do we grow that? How do we sustain that? So our collective challenge, and we will play our part as an organisation, is how do we inspire more people to want to learn? How do we create new ways for them to learn? And how do we make sure that everyone gets that fair chance in life? That's the challenge. That's the challenge for us for our next 100 years. It's the challenge for all of us working on lifelong learning and social inclusion. So how do we get there? How do we meet that challenge? Well, I'm delighted that we've got a really expert panel who I'm assured have got all the answers to those questions that I just posed. So no pressure. So I'd like to invite our panelists up to the stage, and just whilst they're moving forward, so Nick and to Kirsty and to Mark, if you want to come and join us. Whilst we're doing that, we're going to try to open a poll online. So those of you watching in Slido, this should appear in your polls tab. Those of you that are here in person, if you've got the Slido app, you can open it up and it should appear. And in fact, there's a QR code and the code for Slido. So if we can show the poll on the screen, please. Any moment. So the question is basically, I've set that challenge of how do we build that culture of lifelong learning in the decades ahead. So you've got some options to pick from, and we might, within the room, if you don't have the Slido app, we'll pick some of this up in the Q&A a bit later on. But the options you will have are building lifelong learning into other services like health, so making learning that golden thread through other policy areas. Secondly, providing greater support for training and retraining at work. Thirdly, creating more flexible and online learning options. We've seen that's really spiked up during the pandemic. Fourthly, introducing a right to lifelong learning, making it universal and lifelong. Fifthly, providing maintenance. That's a bit unexpected. We'll edit this bit out afterwards. Fifthly, providing maintenance support for people whilst learning. And then lastly, a campaign to raise awareness. So there's loads more stuff I know that we could pick, but those are the options we've selected. You can pick up to 2, and for those of you in the room, you can vote away if you've got the app, and we will discuss it during the Q&A as well, so get those thoughts percolating. Right, so I'm now going to ask each of our panellists just to say a few words about what they view as what we need to do for to make this the lifelong learning century ahead. So first I'm going to ask Nick Hillman, who's the director of the Higher Education Policy Institute. And Nick, lots of debates about higher education at the moment. Over that last century, we've seen such a great expansion in higher education. What's next?
Well, Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And it was so inspiring. It's my first visit, actually, to City Lit, and it was so inspiring to hear from the learners beforehand. My organisation, as you said, focuses specifically on higher education, but of course there are tremendous links between all forms of adult education, further education, skills training, and what goes on in our universities. And I think where the particular areas where my organisation and yours have particular overlaps perhaps are things like the dramatic decline, sadly, in part-time and mature learning in recent years. When I started doing this sort of job that I do, I used to be a teacher, and before I moved into policy, around about 4 in 10 new higher education students were part-time mature students. Now it's only about half of that. So there is a real challenge here. And the other area where we overlap a lot with what you do is, I think, with those hardest to reach groups. So, for example, we've done quite a lot of work on prisoner education. Prisoners can't access funding unless they're on a very short sentence or close to the end of their sentence. And we're just doing some work at the moment on access to education among homeless people. So as well as obviously struggling to get secure accommodation, access to education and therefore the next stages in their lives can be very challenging for homeless people. There are, I think, lots of challenges, and I've referred to some that we all face. But you know, I do think a centenary should be an opportunity to celebrate and to think of things that are going well. And I do think we do stand on the cusp, potentially, not inevitably, but potentially of some really positive shifts. So there's legislation currently before Parliament in the Skills and Post-16 bill that could make it much easier for people to do short courses, to get access for courses they may have been shut out from before. I think there's a better understanding, and I think maybe the pandemic's encouraged this, of the non-financial benefits of education. I think we've all, haven't we, a little bit reassessed our lives and what matters to us most during the pandemic, and lots of people are then implementing that in their own lives and their own families' lives. And if I may just end by just saying 2 things that I think it's really important that we bear in mind as we look to the next century. And the first is, I really dislike the analogy we typically hear in education of ladders. You know, you're on a ladder, you're either on one ladder or the other, and you get as high up the ladder as you possibly can. And we published a publication where someone used an alternative analogy of a climbing frame. You know, you can change direction, you can go diagonally, you can move from one area to another area. And I think as the economy changes and as people live longer, then that's a really important thing that we should strive to aim for. And the second plea I would make, and it's fantastic to see, for example, David Hughes in the room, who does such good work with colleges, is that we mustn't pit one part of education against another bit of education. Often policy becomes FE versus HE, for example. Actually, we're all in the same industry, we're all in the same job, we all want to improve people's opportunities. HE and FE should be partners. They often overlap in the offers they make. They're not offering completely different things. And I hope if we bear those two things in mind, then we can make maybe as much progress in the early stages of the next century as was made 100 years ago, as we've already heard this morning, in the early stages of the last century. Thank you.
And I know as the first person in my family to go to university, I know the difference that higher education makes, and that I wouldn't be here and doing this job, but also the difference it's made to my life as well. So we need to value the best in higher education. I'm going to ask Kirsty Donnelly, who's the Chief Executive of City and Guilds, to speak next. And ma'am, I know that you're also the patron of City and Guilds, so never let it be said that you don't get value for money from a Learning and Work Institute event. It's two for one offer today. So Kirsty, we're delighted to have you here, and I'll pass over to you if you want to just take the microphone as well.
I normally don't have a problem being heard, but here's the mic anyway. But Her Royal Highness is actually our president, so yeah, really, really good value. But so lovely to see you also here today, ma'am, and great to be here. And I was reflecting, really. I mean, you're going to hear quite a lot of the similar themes. I think you won't be surprised to know in terms of when you set us up, Stephen, to being some of the experts. There's lots of experts in this room, and many who aren't with us today. But actually, was struck by one of the comments that one of your learners made in the session earlier, when they said, "Well, just go for it." And I thought that's probably a message we could all take from today, because I think we are just having to go for this. This is the century, I think, in which, as you just said, Nick, that we do have to make and create a lifelong learning culture that is going to be sustainable for what is incredibly fast-changing times, as we've witnessed ever more so in the recent pandemic. So it's great to be here talking about this fitting topic of lifelong learning and celebrating 100 very good years. And it was fascinating, really, when you reflect back and think, well, 100 years ago, what would people have been learning? And in many cases, many young people particularly wouldn't necessarily have even been going to school. They would have still been in mills or working on farms, or if they were going to school, there was the concept of night schools. And in fact, I'm very sure that the Learning Work Institute were already contributing to those sorts of opportunities 100 years ago. So it was very different 100 years ago to how it is today. And there are many things that, of course, have improved in those 100 years. But of course, there is still things that we know we still haven't got right. And in many respects, the education system hasn't moved on as quickly or as agilely as it's needed to in those 100 years. And I think that's where we've got to really focus as we look forward. And one thing, of course, that was certain pretty much 100 years ago, whatever you trained for when you left school, or whatever form of training and apprenticeship that you may have undertaken, you were pretty much in a job for life. And of course, that's not the case now. We now know that we're talking about 5-decade careers. We're talking about at least 14% of the working population are going to have to retrain completely over the next few years in order to be able to cope with the skills that are needed for the future. So these are real, genuine challenges that we face. And on top of that, as we've already heard from Nick, we know there are funding challenges. We know that there's been a real term cut, and David Hughes will know this very well, in terms of adult learning, adult funding, to the tune of 45% in the last 10 years alone. So there are some things that we systemically have to put right if we're going to look ahead with the positivity that I would agree Nick and both you, Stephen, have talked to this morning. And so there are three things really that I think we do need to look to do to try and make a better system, a more sustainable, fairer system. So we hear many, many more young stories of the learners we heard from this morning going for it, and really seeing lifelong learning opportunities as their breakthrough moment when they got a second or third chance to really go on to do great things, as we've already heard. And the first one of those is I'm afraid it's the old chestnut of much better careers advice and guidance. guidance. We've simply just got to invest in careers advice and guidance. Without it, we have a broken system. And so I think, you know, it's a well-trodden piece of rhetoric. I'm sorry, it's nothing particularly new, but we have got to do more when it comes to giving careers advice and guidance, and doing it in a much more modern 21st century way as well. I think we need to embrace where and how digital and technology can provide that advice and guidance, and where it can really map to the where the real local labour market opportunities are. So we really connect the supply and demand system up properly. I think the second thing I would look to, and again, Nick, it's something that you talked to, is to create less binary choices for young people. We're expecting children at 14 to make a binary choice to choose GCSEs, A-levels and degrees, as opposed to the other opportunities that now are unfolding in a good way. You know, it's great now that we've got the government rhetoric of T-levels, technical skills, apprenticeships. There are many more pathways and opportunities, but we do need to do more to promote those, and again, not create these forced choices, binary choices at age 14. Allow for stepping off transition points. Let's look at that whole cradle to grave opportunity for people to transition between the multiple jobs that they're going to have. And then thirdly, again, it picks up on a theme from you, Nick. Let's really go and create a culture of lifelong learning, a whole cradle to grave culture of lifelong learning. That means employers, government, providers, educationalists, and indeed learners themselves, all investing in that lifelong learning culture, because lifelong learning, having a lifelong learning culture will give us lifelong learning employability, which is where it all really counts. Thank you very much.
And I definitely echo the point about careers advice there as well. When we did a pilot a few years ago, careers reviews for people around about the age of 50-ish, people were just surprised to be asked, but kind of lapped up the opportunity and putting it in the context of what's going on more widely in their life and the opportunities that they've got ahead, particularly with longer life expectancies. So completely echo that, but delivering it in new ways and relevant ways is, I think, the key point. Just before I pass over to our final speaker, just a reminder for those of you that are watching online that you can put your Q&A into the Q&A bit of the Slido app, and I will try, technology permitting, to pick those up later and get through as many questions as we can. So do put those in there, and those of you in the room, you can do that as well, but just put your hand up later probably is easier, to be honest. So put your Q&A in the chat if you're watching online. So last but not least, we're really pleased to have Mark Malcolmson, the Principal and Chief Executive of CityLit. And Mark, I mentioned earlier how grateful we are for your support over the years and for today, and the great job that CityLit's done providing opportunities for people to learn over the last 100 and a bit years. The bit kind of takes you beyond us. So Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Your Royal Highness, honoured guests, we're delighted to have you here. As has been said, we celebrated with the Princess Royal 2 years ago, just before the pandemic, our centenary. And I think there is that point that Stephen made and Nick made, which is 100 years ago, there had been a terrible war. But people focused on the future and the aspirations. We've just been through a very difficult few years as a nation, but it also gives us a chance to restate our values and look forward and say what we can do as a country and as individuals. And for me, I think there are 3 bits where adult education, as well as all the great stuff education does as a whole, there are 3 things that are often unsung. And I often feel it's heretical to say these things, because governments, after years and years, focus on skills, level 1, level 2, progressions, all of those things that are hugely important. But it often loses some of the texture and some of the really important things that adult education is allowed to provide, and has been something that this institution, many other institutions that I see around the room, have been part of. So I'd make 3 points. The arts. The arts are crucial. They're often overlooked. They're often seen as a hobby. Interestingly, a quote in August this year, the creative industries are something that we are genuinely world-class at. That was Rishi Sunak, our Chancellor, actually stating what is blindingly obvious to a lot of us. Before the pandemic, 6% of our economic output was through the arts. That was £58 billion of exports that this country made through the various areas of arts. It's unsung in so many ways. It's often diminished and dismissed. but it is something that adds to the wonderful nature of this country, and we need to nurture that, and we need to encourage young and older artists to continue. And that's a broad brush. So if I look at some of our more famous alumni here at the college, an unknown sculptor came here 30 years ago, not to actually do sculpture, actually came here to do public speaking, because he realized he had to actually explain his art and go forward and actually make a business out of it. That sculptor comes back 5 years ago to do beginner ceramics here at the college, because it's one of the practices that he hasn't mastered just quite yet. Anthony Gormley's done quite well, and to be honest, we take great pride, and he was actually spoke at our Mental Wealth Festival last month. We take great pride as he's somebody who's come over a journey of 30 years being involved in lifelong learning. If you look at creative writing, something that this country has centuries of huge pedigree and passion for, is we've produced Booker Prize winners, we've produced the Children's Laureate in Mallory Blackman, and of course we produced the great Andrea Levy, who wrote Small Island while she was a student here. Now, 5 years ago, Andrea Levy said to me that it wouldn't have been without adult education that she'd been able to actually write the books. The critique, the support from peer support that you get when you're in a class, the expert tuition you get, and the guidance about how to be published were all crucial in her success. So for me, it's not like producing, say, 200-300 plumbers or electricians. The arts are very, very different. There's something that take individual nurturing, and not everybody's going to make it, but actually their lives are going to be better because of it. So I think that's area one that I think is really important for us, that we continue to nurture that as part of adult education in this country. Secondly, and I'm delighted to have Ilias here as one of our students, is it's communities that are often overlooked and marginalized in society. One of the first courses that we taught here at CityLit 102 years ago was lip reading for students and soldiers who had been deafened in shell fire during the First World War. From that, we have grown and developed our Centre for Deaf Education, and that's gone from strength to strength, and we've got Mark Hopkinson here who heads that centre, and we've got our wonderful signers here. Now, actually, if you look in employment rates for people who are deaf or of hard of hearing, they are well below the national average. And it is something that is a bit of a national embarrassment for us. In a similar way, our work with adults with learning disabilities, only 6% of adult with learners' disabilities are in employment, whereas 65% of those adults want to be in employment, not just for the money they earn, but for the self-respect and the self-esteem they're able to gain by going out and working and getting a job. So if you look at the communities that are often marginalized, we as adult educators have a huge part to play in supporting those and helping those groups actualize. It also applies as well, we've got a world-class adult stammering unit here, and that's a group that 1% of the British public suffer from disfluency in some form. They often get jobs. They're not necessarily marginalized in employment, but actually they progress far slower than people with normal fluency. And that's because they often don't put themselves forward. They don't often feel the confidence they can do for doing the interview process or whatever. So for us, supporting those groups, encouraging those groups, and integrating them into an institution like this is hugely important. And then finally, I think this is the bit that might be quite controversial because it doesn't lead to job outcomes, it doesn't lead to those specific things that government talks about so much. I have genuinely been humbled and often reduced to tears during the pandemic by letters, emails that I've got from our students. They're often lonely, isolated, unwell, and often the older in society. They have been forgotten, they feel alone, and the pandemic made that far worse. And there's one story that really has heartened me, is that as a student I've got to know very well on Zoom during the course of the pandemic. She is in the latter stages of motor neurons disease. She is completely disabled, she can't leave her house, but her creative writing course at CityLit gives us a window to the world, gives her a window to the world. And for me, her opportunities to take that. And by the way, it's interesting, the tutor says she's by far the best student in the class. For me, groups like that are often forgotten. They're out of sight, out of mind. Interestingly, this is a college for 100 of our years had never done anything online. We'd always been in person. We always prided ourselves that community was a personal thing. We've learned. I've been proved wrong. You can create communities online, and you can also reach those people that can't get out of the house, not necessarily part of a community in other ways, and therefore improve their mental health and well-being, improve society as a whole. And those things are really important, and where adult education is something I'm hugely proud of being part of. And for us, we need to think about what we've done in the last 100 years and how we can do better and how we can improve going forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark. I'm going to open it up a bit now, so keep the questions coming in on the app. I'm going to take the first question from the app, and then I'm going to look for a forest of hands out here with things to quiz the panel with. So first question, perhaps I put to you, Kirsty. So one of the things that we've talked about in different fora before, actually, is about the institutions that help people get into learning and also deliver that learning as well. So that kind of stability is not a word you necessarily associate with this sector. So I wonder if you'd maybe say a little bit about what do you think, what are some of those institutions and how do we sort of nourish them and encourage them and help build that network for adult education?
That's a really good point, because I think it sort of goes back to what I was saying in my opening words, really, that if we are serious about building a next 100 years sustainable lifelong learning culture, which I think probably in this room, looking around in this room for some nods, we would all hope violently agree is the thing we need to do, and there now is a case. I mean, there is a business case for that to be the case. Then I think we do need to recognise that there is an ecosystem, if I can use that word, of different players within that lifelong learning culture, that ecosystem that we need to create. And therefore, I think we need to value all of those different players for what they bring. I think going through the pandemic as we did, there were a number of organisations in this room who, when it mattered, we did come together. We came together to work with, lobby government, talk about what was needed to try and manage through the pandemic. But at times, there were probably moments, if we're being really honest, where there was that sort of sense of people vying for what they needed as opposed to working together. So I suppose if we're really going to recognise, especially those more marginalised institutions who actually do have so much to offer, especially when you think about the more diverse communities that we want to reach, I think we've got to bring them in and sort of embrace it as part of one ecosystem. There is actually still, despite the decline in funding, there is still funding there. There is still funding available. It's how we use the funding. It's how we actually make sure we put the funding to its best use that I think we then all benefit from. So there is an element here of coming together, really, and really not competing with each other, but trying to work with the limited resources we've got and trying to spread them out as widely as we can. I do think, finally, there is something about, and this is something we need to work with government, about getting government to recognise the local labour market and the local regional devolvement of skills and those agendas. So I think there's a lot more we need to do to push to make sure that funding does flow right down to the grassroots level and local level. And I think larger institutions can do more to try and make that happen.
Thanks, Kirsty. I'm going to, does anyone in the audience want to ask a question? If you could pop your hand up. Yes, yes. Basically, all my predecessors in this role are now got a mention or asking a question. So I'm kind of. So can the gallery just be ready to cut off the mic just in case? But Alan, if you so I've run now. Yeah, I've kind of introduced you anyway. But do you want to introduce yourself and then just ask the question?
I'm Alan Tuckett. I've worked in IS for a long time, about a quarter of those 100 years. Nick said it's all one system, really. I wondered what the panel would give advice to schools to do to create the platform of a lifelong learning culture for the next 100 years.
That's a good question, and you're welcome. So yeah, we've done a lot of work in the past, including with Alan and David, about family learning, but also inculcating that culture from the start. And it kind of links a little bit to a point about that, Kirsty, you were making about adult career guidance and kind of how you sort of make that a seamless link from education through. So maybe, Nick, shall we kind of start with you on that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, I'm conscious that I'm be preaching to a room of people who know even more about these issues and sort of preaching to the converted. But I mean, I might answer that actually as a parent. So I'm a parent of a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old, and my son has just started secondary school, our local state secondary school, and you know, seeing the opportunities that he's already getting to do things that I never had the chance to do when I was at secondary school has been so eye-opening. Things he thought he was going to absolutely dread, like dance, but actually just getting the chance to experience that. So I think giving people as rich a curriculum from as young an age as possible. Obviously, the intergenerational stuff is particularly important that you mentioned. From my own area of higher education, we know, for example, the best widening participation initiatives are the ones that bring the parents of potential students onto campus as well as the potential students. They're very expensive to deliver, but they're very important. And then the third thing I would say is, of course, access, and you've already said it, but to that really good careers advice, because there are, you know, I'm a former teacher. I think teaching is the most noble profession. Both my parents are teachers. You know, I come from a family of educators. But sometimes, you know, you're not as exposed to all the wide range of opportunities in the world that are out there in every school. And I think getting information about apprenticeships, about non-traditional routes, yes, about higher education sector I work in, but about all the other opportunities into the hands of people when they're, you know, when they're uncertain what they want to do with their lives. And so I absolutely agree with you that when I was working in Whitehall and we looked into this, we found, you know, you got more bang for buck in terms of social mobility by spending on good quality careers, information, advice and guidance than you did on almost anything else. Because, of course, if you're stopping people making poor decisions first time round. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
So we're probably one mic short here. We're doing a relay. But Mark, if I can sort of maybe put that question to you, but also link it back to something, again, asked through the app about, because we mentioned the pandemic and online learning and things like that, and how we tackle the digital divide, because some people don't have the kit or the broadband or the digital skills, so how we kind of bring that stuff together as well.
Thanks, Stephen. First of all, to answer Alan's question, I think it's really important that schools change the narrative around education. I think the idea that you kind of get to 16, 18, 21, maybe 25, depending on what you're doing, and you're done, was always probably stupid, but now it's so out of date. For me, the idea that you are going to carry on learning through your life. And if you look at the work of Professors Grattan and Scott at London Business School, they talk about the lifelong learning, the 100-year life. The idea that somehow you're lock and loaded at 21 and you're ready for the next 50 years of employment and life is insane. And I don't think that narrative, and having a child who just turned 21 last week, that narrative hasn't got through. You kind of think, oh, I'll just get to the end and then I'm done. It's not. And it shouldn't be, oh God, then it'll be a slog for another 50 years. It's actually, education's a wonderful thing. I think obviously preaching to the converted, but it is something that is life-affirming, that can make you reinvent yourself so many times. And if we can convey that to youngsters, that you don't drop out. What we find here is interesting, that we don't get many people under 30. They kind of finish education and then kind of go off, and then come back in their 30s or 40s, very much depending on family circumstances, etc. And they kind of go back and go, yeah, I felt I was done, but then I realized I wasn't. And that, for me, is something really important, that if we can kind of get it into people's minds that education will stretch through your life, and that's a good thing, not a chore, that will make a massive difference, I think. So for me, that would be the biggest help that schools could do for adult educators, to make sure that people know that there's a value for them. Secondly, the point around the digital divide. I think that is what's fascinating. The two bits that I've learned during the pandemic about people going online is that, first of all, if you can't afford to have data and you can't afford to have a machine, then you are even more excluded. And there's a lot of work done around school kids, and that's obviously been great work. It's not been enough. But actually with adults, it's even more so. So if I've got my 5G and I've got my iPad and my laptop and everything, it's all great. I've got to learn how to use them, admittedly, which is a bit of a challenge on occasions. But that creates a problem, because if you haven't got that, you have no on-ramp. And therefore, the digital divide is more. Now, there's been a lot of work done to get devices and get capacity to younger people, and that should be extended through all ages. But the other bit, the heretical thing that I think that has really disabused us during the pandemic is the idea that the older don't use devices and they're not going to embrace online. Actually, you look at the demographics of the City Lit online enrolments during the course of the pandemic. Actually, we've kind of got considerably older, which is a different challenge, but actually, they've embraced, older learners have absolutely embraced digital as an opportunity, particularly around isolation and kind of continuing their learning. So I think there's two twists there. It's ensuring socioeconomic divides aren't exacerbated, but actually also getting rid of outdated thinking that if you're old, you won't go on a device or whatever.
Thank you. That's two pitches at hereticism you've done today, but I think we're with you. Oh, Kirsty, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the next question and then we'll put those two together. So yes, Tom.
Thanks. Tom Schuller, worked in various bits of lifelong learning, most latterly as chair of the governors of the Working Men's College, which I'm sorry to say has bragging rights well over City Lit, 1854. My question is this. Everyone in this room is persuaded of the arguments that everyone has put forward. Why are so few other people outside, namely people in power, why are they not persuaded of these arguments?
I'm really beginning to query the wisdom of this guest list, because everyone seems to be running an organisation or working for an organisation that's much, although I'm feeling younger now, so that's good. I think that's a really good question. So maybe Kirsty, if any points from Alan's question you want to pick up, but also that point as well?
No, it's a really, really great point, because I mean, if you look back, we did a piece of work called Sense and Instability, deliberately titled that way. About 2015, we produced the first one, and then we produced a follow-up the following year. And it sort of looked to something like 67 different skills ministers that we'd had over a 30-year period, as opposed, and I'm not pitting between FE and HE now, but as opposed to the sort of 16 HE ministers that we'd had over the same time period. I use that really just to sort of give an example of the fact that, unfortunately, skills, if I use the word skills for lifelong learning, adult education in its broadest sense, does tend to get kicked around as the political football, and therefore it does change every 5-7 years, and therefore it hasn't had the same stability, the same sustainability, the same levels of funding. That is just a fact. So I think that is just something that we've just got to keep working at and prove through impact, through measuring impact, through looking at the great outcomes that come from investing in adult learning and lifelong learning. And I think the government are starting to listen. I'm going to sound slightly optimistic now. I mean, I think the new Secretary of State that's come through, I think there is a willingness to actually start to listen to the arguments about investing in careers advice and guidance, investing in lifelong learning because of the returns. But I think the pandemic has been the biggest game changer of that, because I think they've recognised that planning and investing in things 5-10 years and kicking things into long grass isn't going to help the here and now of the huge skills gaps that we find ourselves in today. So I think there's a kind of cause and effect that's going on. But I just don't think we've had enough funding coming through it. I mean, it's as simple as that, and we haven't had enough joining up of the system simply because the skills, the adult education programme has been treated, as I said, at government level as a bit of a political football, and we do need to do something about that. Just very quickly on careers advice and guidance, I think there's a link, because I think what we need to do there is stop measuring the wrong things. So schools go down a particular path because they are funded and measured in that way. If we actually stop measuring those things, if schools were measured also on the number of people they got through to apprenticeships, for example, not just the school league tables around how many go to HE, I think straight away we would start to see a slightly different slant on things.
Thanks, Kirsty. I'll make the point as well, actually, that our survey that I mentioned earlier, the biggest reason adults give for not learning is that they're not interested or can't see why they should. So I think that goes back to the ones who get into learning tend to do loads and loads of learning, and we've heard that story from our learners today. It's how do we get more people interested, which I think needs to be that wider effort. I'm going to take a final question just from that table there, and then I'm going to give everyone a chance to answer that question, but also craft any final thoughts as we approach the last few minutes into their answers as well.
Hi, Sheila Hollins. I used to be a psychiatrist, and my interest in learning is in part about the fact that people can't learn if they're distressed, troubled in some way, and that the transferable skills that employers need and for lifelong learning really require you to be resilient and to have what CityLit calls mental wealth. And I just think there's not enough emphasis on that somehow the curriculum subjects don't necessarily include all those skills that build resilience. So the creativity, the communication skills, the teamwork that builds the confidence we need for work.
Great, thank you. So what I'll ask the team to do as well is if we can off the poll online and get ready to kind of just show that in a couple of minutes, please. And in the meantime, Nick, if we start with you, any of those questions, but also some final thoughts.
Well, thank you. I'll just start by saying that our organisation is nothing like 100 years old. We were 18 last year, and we were looking forward to having a raucous 18th birthday party with lots of loud music and alco pops. But the pandemic put paid to that, sadly. But perhaps we can have a 21st birthday party instead. I mean, it's some really powerful questions. I'd just like to come back maybe to Tom's question. Why don't we, as a policy-making community, and my organisation sits between the education sector and the policymakers, value all of this adult learning as much as the people in this room. And I think part of the problem is it has become judged sometimes solely by financial metrics, and as the final question shows, of course, this whole area is about much more than financial metrics, and my organisation's done a huge amount of work, for example, on student mental health. But even when we do, and to a certain degree, we do need to think about the financial metrics if, for example, we're trying to persuade the Treasury to give us money. But the problem is, even when we do think about it in financial ways, or policymakers do, we do it in a very short horizon. So, for example, our work on prisoners that I've already referred to showed that, you know, in Whitehall, no assessment had been taken into account that if prisoners had better access to education, there'd be better prisoners, they'd be cheaper to look after, they'd have much better rates of succeeding in the community once they'd left prison. So when we do succumb to purely economic models of the value of education, we need to do it in a very expansive way and think about the broader benefits to society and community of, in that particular example, keeping people from going back into prison, for example. And I referred to homeless people before, another group where a little bit of investment could pay huge dividends. But thank you once again for inviting me to be part of your fantastic celebration.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, just I think to answer Tom's point is I don't think we're bold enough. I think we talk to ourselves a little bit, and we need to take great pride in what we do, and we need to be more out there about it. We need to use people who will advocate on our behalf, and we need to go out there and actually point to really good examples of really good people who've benefited from adult learning, and also be not restrictive around what adult learning is. That can be going to your Waterstones and buying a book or seeing a book talk. It can be doing lots of different things that keep your brain engaged. So for me, it's actually being very proud of what we are and who we are, and also talking to people that we don't usually talk to. The final point that Baroness Hollins made, which I think is hugely important, is let's not just define ourselves in terms of education. We have a huge effect on ability around community, and we have a massive effect on well-being. And both of those are critical given what we've just been through in the last 2 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to build on that point and that question, I think neurodiversity, cognitive diversity is something that we are should be talking about a lot more and building into our curriculums, into our pathways through education. There isn't enough of it happening. You're absolutely right about that. And I think at our peril. And I think when we talk to employers, which we do literally every day, most things that employers will tell me that's missing isn't so much the technical skills, they can teach those, it is actually those human skills, it is those cognitive diversity skills. So I think there is a lot more that we need to do as a sector to address that. I think then there's a lot that employers need to do to actually help support how that happens in the workplace and how you create opportunities for older workers and younger employees to work together and learn together. And you start to see, we run something called the Princess Royal Training Awards. I know it's awful to use the fact that we have with the Princess Royal in the room now, but they are a fantastic example of what is great about when employers really invest in lifelong learning. They really invest in their individuals' learning opportunities. And we've seen some great examples of employers who work across the panacea of helping younger employees come through the workforce by delivering their own lifelong learning agendas and using older workforces to learn those skills and to create that not cognitive, more neuro diversity. So I think it's an agenda we need to do a lot more about, and one we've not fully understood yet in the world of education, but I do think it's incredibly important. And my last thought would be, let's measure the right things ultimately, and as our learner said this morning, just go for it.
Well, that seems like a pretty good way to finish. I think we could have kept going for a lot longer, but I'm going to have to draw us to time. So can I ask you all to thank Nick and Kirsty and Mark for their contributions as they return to their seats. Right, well, as we mentioned earlier, we're very proud to have Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal as our patron and a long-standing supporter, not just of the work that we do, but of the work of lifelong learning and adult education more generally. So I think a thank you on behalf of the sector, as well as an organisation, to you, ma'am, for your support. And we're delighted to have you here today to help us celebrate our centenary. And so I'd like to invite you, ma'am, to come and say a few words. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. I think it would have been wise to have asked me before that question and answer session, not afterwards, because I've go off at a tangent. I'm delighted to see so many people here, and I'm sure there are a lot more who have joined in, because this is such an important part of life, and it is important organisation. Marking a centenary is entirely justified. It is, of course, an opportunity to look at that historic perspective, which in its own right is really interesting. And if you look at what was happening at that time, and I'm not into bragging rights here, but Eglantine Jebb started to Save the Children in 1919, but she trained as a teacher. When she went to university as a woman, that was still regarded as a bit of an odd thing to do. And when she worked her first job in schools was in a rural school in Marlborough. And she couldn't understand why the children didn't appear on a regular basis. So instead of just bemoaning the fact, she actually followed them home. And she discovered the sort of situations they came from, the places they lived, and the problems that they faced had the effect on them being able to go to school. She thought school was what every child wanted to do, because she had that curiosity of approach to everything. So it was the ability for children to make use of that, at whatever school level, that she thought was important. But she also saw that if you didn't support particularly mothers to understand the benefits of education, then you didn't actually make a huge amount of progress. So a lot of my experience in this sense has been coloured by Save the Children's both its own history and that fundamental importance that it saw as education at the earliest opportunity. But it never stopped, because it included the family and it included the ability to build on their own skills. But of course, the First World War was equally important. As you said, this is a time when these institutions came into existence, because it was women who went into the workplace in a way that they hadn't done before. So that introduced a very new aspect of education and the importance of the education women as well. And I think I'd also say that the military already had its own educational career paths, because they were starting with people who frequently didn't have any skills. To some extent, that still happens, and they've learned how to provide that backing throughout their military careers. And I know from my work with the Butler Trust in prisons, the importance of adult literacy, I'm sorry to say, was almost only available in prisons, because that's you had your captive audience. So it's not a pun, that was the point. They were there, they couldn't really escape. But they also developed ESOL in many of these prisons as becoming fundamentally important, and building that out from there. I kind of sympathise with prisons. The justice system doesn't encourage those on shorter sentences to actually get involved. It's quite hard to get those youngsters at their first stage to be part of that. But I equally despair at the fact that areas of prison life which used to create the opportunities for careers were removed on the basis they weren't seen to be relevant. I won't go into that, but it kind of missed the point in terms of the access points to future careers, and the learning process needs to be everywhere. And it doesn't really matter. You don't make a decision on the basis if you don't happen to think it's interesting and it's not a career you wanted to go into. The fact that it is a learning process and attracts people to it, I think is very important. But if you're going back far enough, and I would go back to the 1851 Commission, you're talking about the importance of arts. One of the things that Prince Albert did when he created Albertopolis was to recognise the importance of the arts and the sciences, and particularly industry, and that is still the background of that 1851 Commission and its students, is linking together art and industry in a way that nobody else quite did. And you're absolutely right, it's still a very important part of what should be on offer. But you never quite know what that's going to start. I've just come from Stratford, slightly different link. It was the Olympic link, so building on the futures of London. But I went to the Theatre Royal in Stratford. It's an absolutely charming historical quirk, but it still exists, and it creates that extraordinary centre of gravity, which they've been able to turn into a place where it inspires people through the arts and creativity into careers, which is not something you can explain very easily elsewhere. And I apologise because I will go off at a tangent. Don't forget, as patron of learning and work, I've already been through 5 separate titles. I get slightly confused. In theory, they're all doing the same things, and I slightly wonder if it wouldn't be better if we just called it lifelong learning, which was kind of what we were trying to do. And lifelong learning does seem to define what we are all trying to do, that it is the bedrock of what we're offering, and it is the confidence, isn't it, to go and access a lifelong learning in almost any way you deem fit. But the inspiration to do lifelong learning, to go back into education, that is what is different for every individual, which is why every organisation is valuable if it can attract whoever into that process, because it happens to suit them. So the collaboration has to be part of the structure. It won't happen through one organisation. It will happen because it's a partnership who recognise the value of different aspects and where those access points are. I have to say I've been hugely encouraged by schools and organisations which have taken that on. One in Oban that he designed to do the qualifications for apprenticeships as well as the technical, based on local employers. That was a decision made by the headmaster and his governors, not by anybody else. And I think the comment we heard earlier about more local and acceptance, that they understand those access points better, is also crucial. Plumpton College of Agriculture took a lot of youngsters who had been excluded from school. They had to persuade a local education authority that was appropriate. But it was really appropriate for those youngsters who didn't want to stay in school, weren't allowed to do anything else, but were given an option to be more involved and to link it into why the education process was still important. This organisation, I know it's changed its title, and that fundamental has been there, but there are an awful lot of providers out there who need the support of the older organisations to say, you are doing the right thing, this is necessary, it is important for the future. If we look at the working lives today, that's probably going to lengthen. You won't be able to stay in the same job for your life. You will need to retrain, you'll need to perhaps change altogether. Giving people the confidence that they can do that is fundamentally important to those individuals and to the businesses that they will continue to work with and want to be involved with. The other areas which remain a major issue, I have to say, working with young care leavers. Sorry to say, that was another Save the Children report that they did on young care leavers. When they issued the report, 23 different countries appeared. We didn't even know they were interested. It's an issue that challenges every statutory authority, is dealing with that gap between leaving care and moving to the next stage of their lives. And young adult carers, which the Trust for Carers, when it started, did a serious amount of research on to understand how it affected their lives and what happened next. Although you'll be encouraged to hear that about 80% of young carers are likely to go into the caring professions, which is interesting because you think it might have exactly the opposite effect, but they understand. And I know that schools, the importance of that relationship. When I started with ALPSU, they weren't allowed to go anywhere near schools because it was all about adult literacy, so it was nothing to do with schools. But it has become very apparent that it has to be part of your lifelong learning. It has to be to support teachers to be able to allow them to plan in lifelong, that they don't have to sort of get too over productive, again, fitting into those figures and the qualifications. And I may have already mentioned this, but I met a teacher, she was actually in pre-primary, and she described to me what I thought was average chaos in this kind of open plan lesson, that the ones splashing paint around were becoming artists, the ones finally doing their figures were becoming mathematicians, and the other ones who were constructing and deconstructing with blocks in the corner were becoming engineers. She's right. That is terminology which introduces you to the careers in life, not itemizing it as a form of play. I thought that was almost genius, and I've told as many people as I can think of that story, because I do think when you talk about careers and what young people think they can do, if they haven't been told that being able to count is actually being a mathematician, they will never believe they can do maths. And I thought that was a really interesting piece of logic. It's just terminology, it's just semantics, but it introduces you to careers. And I thought that was something that perhaps a lot of other people might want to adopt right the way through your school career, because it does introduce you to where you might be going next, because you can evolve a skill at that stage. So I'm sorry for going off at a complete tangent, but I just think that these organizations, and Learning and Work Institute, from its foundation, its ability to support those who want to extend careers, who want to change careers, has been there. But we are now faced with a world which has so much more knowledge than it did 100 years ago. We're adding to that knowledge base every week. How on earth do people sort out what you need to know to be able to access it? Well, the answer is basic skills and some very understanding people who can help you, give you the confidence to pursue that knowledge in a way that is going to impact on your life and make your life feel more meaningful to you as an individual. That would be quite an achievement. But if we look at what the internet has done, it could just be confusing, to say the least, and overkill. But nobody gets born with knowledge. You have to start somewhere, and you have to start with the right skills to be able to allow you to access all that information that's out there. We need all of the organizations who understand about lifelong learning to be able to do that, because it will remain, it's not going to get any easier, it's going to remain a challenge. And lifelong learning will offer more and more opportunities and more differences as we go along. So I can only thank those who at least put the structure in place to promote that concept that once you've left school, it isn't it. Thank goodness, a lot of us might say, that you continue to learn, you continue to make use of that learning. And the more we can do that, we are jolly lucky, I think, that so many of our young people stay at school for as long as they do, without actually saying, I've had enough of this, I want to go off and do something different. To encourage them that this is a process that doesn't have an end point, that you can go on doing, is particularly important today because of what COVID has done to them in the last 2 years. It's utterly wrong to say that this is a disaster and it's ruined their lives. It is definitely difficult, but if we truly believe in lifelong learning, then that is a hiccup which we, as supporters of lifelong learning, can help them through and put them on a path to do just as much good as they thought they could have done in the first place. So it's really good time to reflect, yes, on the 100 years that have gone before, but patently what we mean by lifelong learning and what it offers in the future and how we can do it and do it better. So it's a pleasure to join you today. Thank you for listening to me. Kirsty, thank you for saying that we need to measure the right things better.
Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've all found this celebration both interesting and stimulating. To take time out to share in this centenary celebration of the impact of lifelong learning and to think about what the next 100 years might hold has felt like a real privilege. But I'm afraid it's time to start drawing this event to a close. As chair of the Learning and Work Institute, I'm proud of what the Institute and its predecessor bodies have already achieved and of the work we continue to do. We're not a large organisation, but our influence and impact has gone from strength to strength over the years against the backdrop of increasing need and ever scarcer resources. We punch above our weight, and that is down to both the talent and hard work of a great team of staff and to the dedication and vision of our trustees. And so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all and to say how much we value what you do. Thank you too, of course, to all the Festival of Learning winners, especially those who have shared their stories today. By telling us about your experiences, you bring the transformative power of adult learning to life, and you are an inspiration to us all. I also want to add my thanks to City Lit, both for hosting today and for being such a great supporter of the Institute more generally. Adult education is most effective when it is offered in partnership, nationally and locally. And I'm very pleased that so many of our partners have joined us today, both in person and online. This is a testament to how much we want to build collectively on our strong foundations of joint working to make sure that this is a lifelong learning century. And lastly, I'd like to thank you, ma'am, for your ongoing patronage of the Institute and your support for adult education and so many other causes. You have a remarkable record, going back over 30 years as a distinguished ambassador for adult basic skills in the UK. Your patronage of the Basic Skills Agency began in 1990, the International Year of Literacy. The BSA, as you observed, ma'am, has been through many iterations since then and has emerged as the National Learning and Work Institute, for which your patronage continues. And we couldn't be more grateful for your support, your keen interest in our work in literacy, language and numeracy, and in social inclusion, where your related patronage is, as you've so eloquently explained to us with Save the Children and various prison charities, are so relevant. Thank you. I know, though, that as usual, you have a busy schedule and we need to let you get away. And so I'd like to invite everyone to stand as Her Royal Highness leaves to go to her next engagement. And so finally, thank you all very much indeed, not least the people who have been panel members for us today. I'd like you all to stay with us if you can for lunch, and we'll continue our celebrations in the gallery. Thank you.